Now in this part of the project, we're going to save up our file and bring it into Photoshop to add the final details. By now you should have added your house, all of the background, and even the foreground, and saved it up in whatever Illustrator format that you have. From here, let's save it now as a Photoshop document from Illustrator. The first thing we're going to do is go to our Layers panel and let's flatten all of the layers that we have. To do this, go to the Layer options at the top right and choose Flatten Artwork. Notice that this will also unlock the layer that you have. Just to make sure everything is unlocked, we'll go up to Select and choose All to select all of the artwork. Then we can go to Object and make sure Unlock All is no longer an option. So in this case, everything is unlocked. The other thing we need to do is ungroup everything that may be grouped together. So while we're under Object, choose Ungroup. And you may have to do this several times. So go back to Object, Ungroup, Object, Ungroup, until it's no longer an option. So what we've done is we've taken all of our artwork and we've ungrouped it and we've flattened it down into one single layer. From here, this is the most important part about saving your artwork so it can be opened up in Photoshop. We want every little object and piece of artwork that you have to have its own individual layer in Photoshop. Here's how to do that. With the artwork layer selected, let's go back to Layers, and then we're going to tell it to release to layers in sequence. This is going to take all of those objects and give them their own layer. So with that selected, it looks like nothing much has been done, but what it's done is it's taken all of that and now you can see how they have their own individual sublayers. The second part of this is to save it as a Photoshop document. From here, we're going to go to File, down to Export, to export it as a different file format. Choose Export As. This will bring up the options, and you need to give it a name. So in my case, I'm just going to call it my Ivy House. The format we need to save this in will be a Photoshop document, .psd. With Photoshop selected, we don't need to use artboards. We'll say Export, and this will give us some further options we need to make sure are correct. First, make sure your color mode is set to RGB, and your resolution is set to high at 300 pixels per inch. We do want to write the layers, so make sure this option is selected and you can preserve maximum editability. Everything else will remain exactly the same. With Write to Layers turned on, when we say OK, this is going to save our document as a Photoshop file. Once it's saved, I can now see I have a Photoshop document saved on my desktop. Now all I have to do is double click on it to launch Adobe Photoshop. Now that we're in Photoshop, let's have a look at our Layers panel so that you understand how this document is set up. Inside the layers, you can see there is a folder that's got the name of whatever your topmost layer was, in this case artwork. If we open up the folder, you can see now we've got all of the different layers for every object that's part of this work. And it's going to be a lot of layers depending on how complex your artwork is. In my case, I've got 68, and sometimes I've used this, it's well over 100. But that's okay if that happens to you. We're going to take this one part at a time in order to add the embellishments that we need. Now, to make it easier to select the appropriate object, choose your selection tool, the little cross arrow at the very top. We're going to turn on Auto Select and make sure you have Layer selected as well. From here, you can also turn on your Show Transform controls to give you an idea that it's been selected. With this turned on, whenever you click on a layer, it'll automatically jump to that appropriate level. So for instance, if I wanted to check or select this triangle, with one click, it automatically jumps to the correct layer. If I needed to jump over and go to, say, this rectangle, I can click on it and it automatically selects that layer as well. So even though I have lots of different layers, having these options turned on with my selection tool makes it much easier to quickly and easily find and select the area that I want to work on. Now the object of this kind of illustration is to give it a very subtle depth. The way it would look is if it was several pieces of cutout paper that are stacked on top of one another. So we don't want to go for a too extreme of shadows and highlights, but we do want to give it just a little bit of touch in different areas. For instance, let's say I wanted to add a shadow that's inside of each of these little window areas. Then with my selection tool selected, I can click on one of the areas and you can see how it automatically jumps to the appropriate layer. With that done and that layer selected, I can turn on my layer lock and paint inside of just this area. So I'm going to choose my brush tool. With the brush tool selected, you'll need to change to an appropriate size. In this case, I've made mine a little bit smaller, and I'm going to set the hardness to be 0%, so a very soft edge brush. The mode that you need to be painting in will change from normal to multiply, and I'm going to drop my opacity down way low. Between 10 and 20% tends to be pretty good. So working in multiply mode will allow me to paint on an area that darkens in whatever color I have. Now the color that I'm choosing, if you click on your fill color swatch, is going to be just a shade of gray. In this case, maybe a 50% all the way down to here. We just want it to be very subtle. I've not chosen any colors, I just want to work in shades and tints of gray. Now that I've got my brush tool set up to be multiplied, lower opacity, very soft, and I've got the appropriate layer locked down, I can go in and it'll take a couple of different passes, but I can very subtly give this a hint of a shadow edge to it. Next, I can hold down the Command key. This will bring up my selection tool. Click on another object and you can see how it jumped to the correct layer, and I can lock down this layer too. Again, I've got my paintbrush tool set to multiply, and I'm working only with a shade of gray. And so wherever I paint gray, it's going to add that bit of a shadow to it. In this case, I'll add some down to here. Hold down Command and click. Now I started painting there, and it started painting on top of this. So I'm going to undo, back out. Make sure to lock down the transparency of it so it'll stay within your selected area or your selected object. Hold down Command and click, select this one, lock down the transparency, and then paint inside of this. So this works really well whenever you need to paint in an area and only stay on just that object and not affect any of the objects that are around it. Just make sure you've got the correct layer and you've locked down the transparency for that layer. So you can repeat this process for different parts, but you can see how adding just those little shadows adds an illusion of depth to that particular area. Next, you may want to add a set of shadows that is not inside of an object, but actually behind an object. For instance, for this part of the house, I want there to be like a cast shadow going on this right-hand side. And it's going to be behind this triangular area and also this little square that's down here. Now when I do this, it's going to be cast over multiple parts of the house that's behind it. So it's actually easier for me to put a shadow on its own layer and then put that layer behind both of these objects. Here's what I mean. So with my selection tool, I'm going to select, in this case, the triangle at the very top. When I do that, again, it picks up on the appropriate layer. And then from here, I'm going to create a new layer that's below layer, in this case, 59. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to call this layer, as soon as I make it shadow, just so I can differentiate it between the others. And I'm aware I misspelled that. And I'm going to drag it below this, this triangular area. Now with this layer selected, I can grab my paintbrush tool. Now with this one, we don't necessarily need to multiply it. We're just going to work in normal blending mode. So instead of changing the mode of my brush to multiply, I'm going to change the mode of my layer, my shadow layer, to multiply. This way, whatever I paint will blend in with what's behind it, not with the original strokes. Now I can go in with my paintbrush. I've got a relatively large brush this time instead of a smaller one, and start to add on that drop shadow. Again, it may take multiple clicks, but what you want to do is to give an illusion of depth that slowly builds up and adds on to that area. Once you get something that you like, because it's its own layer, you can adjust the opacity. If you think it's too much, I'm going to bring that down just a little bit. And also notice that it went behind this area too. That's because this area is also above the area of my shadow layer. So pay close attention to where you need those shadows are. So for the remainder of the process, go through your entire illustration working one layer at a time or one object at a time, and add an appropriate inner shadow or drop shadow to the area. Once you're finished, it should look like there should be a little bit of depth to everything that you have. All right, with this done, there's a couple of things I just want to point out to emphasize. All of the objects that are on here have some sort of shadow, whether it's a shadow that's on top of their surface or within it, or there's a cast shadow or a drop shadow that's going behind it. Adding those shadows to each individual point is what gives the illusion of depth for this kind of illustration. And remember, take it one layer or one object at a time. Don't try to do too many all at once. The final thing that I did was, you can see on my very topmost layer, this is the layer that has the little cutout that goes around the entire illustration. I made a layer below it and then added a little drop shadow inside of this. So this really adds the illusion of depth to the overall illustration that I've done. Just remember to change your blending mode to multiply depending on what layer you're working on or what brush mode that you're working in order to get that brush to blend in with all of the colors. The final thing we want to do to this is add a paper texture to the overall design to make it look like it's really cut out of paper. Now, in the things that you downloaded, I've given you a variety of different paper textures you can pick and choose from. So whichever one you want to apply, we can go with that. Let's say I wanted to apply one paper texture just to this outer portion and another paper texture to the inner part of the overall house design. To do this, let's do with the outer one first. Let's say I want my outer one to have this nice rough paper texture. With it, so it's paper texture number 4, I'm going to go up to my very topmost layer, select it because this is the layer that I want it to be inside of. Let's go to File and Place, Embedded, and locate that paper texture. There's paper texture 4, and we'll say Place. Now once it's placed, it's going to ask you to resize it, so let's bring it all the way up to fill out the entire area, and then we'll hit our little check at the top to lock it in. Remember, whenever you place something, it's going to bring it in as a rasterized object. Since I want to make some other changes to this, I'm going to de-rasterize this. So with it selected, you can go up to Layer, down to Rasterize, and choose, Smart Object, and choose Rasterized. There we go. So Layer, Smart Object, and Rasterize will rasterize that object and turn it into a normal layer to work in. From here, we can use our clipping mask to clip it inside of Layer 2. So with it selected, you can go up to Layer, down to Create Clipping Mask, and notice now that it's clipped inside of that area. From here, if we need to show out the color that's on there, change your blending mode for this textured layer to multiply, and you can see how it fits within this area. Now whenever you do this, if your paper has a color tint to it, we need to get rid of that color. The quickest way to do that is by going up to Image, Adjustments, there we go, and let's go to our Hue and Saturation. This will bring up the color picker that allows us to change the color of it. But what we want to do is to bring down the saturation of the color all the way down to -100. This will bring it solid as gray. Now for this particular one, there wasn't much color to remove. Let's add another paper texture inside of this to the overall design. To do that, I'm going to select the very first layer that's below all of this. So in this case, it would be Layer 3. Let's place another paper texture. We'll go up to File, down to Place, Embedded, choose another paper texture. I'm going to choose this one because it has a yellow overlay, but I like the little paper weave. We'll say Place, and again, we need to click and drag and rescale it so that it fills the entire area. Be sure to hit the check at the top to commit it. To remove the yellow from here, the first thing we need to do is to rasterize this. Let's go up to Layer, down to Smart Objects. At the very bottom, choose Rasterize. This will turn it into a normal layer without the little icon. Now we can go up to Image, Adjustments, and choose Hue and Saturation. And then bring your saturation all the way down to -100. You can see how that gets rid of all of the color within that area. Now you've got just a black and white texture. From here, change that blending mode of the layer to multiply. And you can see the effect will come through. Now it's a little bit stark, so from here let's also drop the opacity of this layer. Bringing the opacity down will bring our image out just a little bit more. We still want to be able to see the texture, but we don't want it to be so stark. Another thing you could do is go up to Image, Adjustments, and adjust the exposure of it. With the exposure adjustment, this will allow you to make it lighter and also change the offset and gamma to make the darker texture areas show up a little bit more. So depending on the kind of texture that you have, you may want to change it up. The thing about it is we want to be able to see the texture, we just don't want it to be so much in the way. We'll say OK to that. With this, your overall illustration has been finished. You need to save up the Photoshop file, so we'll go to File, Save As. Do make sure your name is on it, and you can call it whatever your name, House, and the format is saved as a Photoshop with all of the layers. We'll hit Save. I'll replace the one that's here. And this Photoshop file is what you'll turn in for your project grade.